Hello, everyone, and welcome to another interesting episode on In the House with John Elvis. And with me on the podcast today, we have an interesting personality who has just recently released an interesting book that's on the history of fantasy sports. And today, I have the honor of speaking to him. He's going to share more about fantasy sports as well as this interesting book, which is already receiving rave reviews. He is also a multifaceted individual. Apart from being an author, he has been an avid player in fantasy sports since 1992, managed across many teams, close to 22 teams, and has been successful in playing both the roles. Founder of a successful financial services company, and I kind of also know that he is a stand-up comedian. So without further ado, um, I would like to invite my guest on my podcast, Mr. Larry Schecter. So, hello, Larry. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great. Thank you for doing this and sharing more insights about your book that you have recently released. Right? How is the book doing?
It's doing great. It turned out better than I could have imagined.
That's right.
The reviews are fantastic.
Right, great. Well, I did a little bit read up, and I know you've been closely associated with fantasy sports since 1992, and you began playing baseball in fantasy sports, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, right.
It's one thing to kind of, play fantasy sports and be a part of fantasy sports. It's another thing to kind of decide to write a book on fantasy sports, right?
Yeah.
What inspired you to write to write this book, The History of Fantasy Sports?
What inspired me is, for several years, I would look at the fantasy industry. When I started, things were completely different than they are now, 30 years later.
Right.
So, going back, maybe 10 years or so ago, I would look around and say, like, how did this all happen?
Right.
People had some ideas for games years ago, and some people started playing, and now here we are years later, and
Right.
there's millions and millions of people playing worldwide.
Yep.
It's a $25 billion a year industry. You got news services, statistics services, everything from fantasy baseball to fantasy wakeboarding, fantasy Iditarod.
Right.
And it's like it just becomes it's a cultural phenomenon. So I just wondered, like, how did this all happen? And nobody's ever written a book about it. There were no books existing about how this all happened. So I thought this is something that is really needed.
Great. But if I have to ask you, how different is your book compared to the other fantasy books, I beg your pardon, on fantasy sports already in the market? So how is it so unique?
There's nothing like this at all. There are books about right. Yeah, there are books about how fantasy baseball strategy, fantasy football strategy.
Right.
There's some books about certain individuals like Matthew Berry, very famous fantasy analyst from ESPN and NBC. He wrote a book that's mostly his own story, but there's never been a book about the history. And what happened is I started out with the idea to write a book about the history of fantasy sports, what happened, who did what, when, and as I started researching, I did a massive amount of research. I did dozens and dozens of interviews, and I started to hear stories that were fascinating. And so I realized very early on, I could write a book, The History of Fantasy Sports, would tell what happened. It would also come off as kind of a boring research paper.
Right.
But by telling the stories of the people that are involved, it became fascinating. It turned out people say it's easier to read. It's fascinating. Some of the stories are inspirational. Some of them bring a tear to your eye. There's a lot of things in the book that are funny. So it tells us, it tells the stories of what people did, and at the same time tells the history of how this all happened. How did we go from some ideas people had as early as the 1950s to now, where you got 200 million people playing fantasy cricket in India.
Wow. Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's pretty famous in India as well, with the cricket fantasy platforms too. Now, what I read a little bit is that you did close to 18 months or more of research. You spoke to a lot of entrepreneurs, you spoke to a lot of players as well. What challenges did you face while you researched for this book or while even writing the book, and how did you manage all that?
Well, the challenges were, you know, talking to people about things that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago, where, I can't even remember what I had for lunch yesterday, let
Yeah,
alone
right,
something that happened 30 years ago.
right,
So that was a challenge, and I'm trying to get correct information because some people would, say things that conflicted. So I had to do a lot of research, a lot of investigating. Um, I actually looked up a lot of articles that I could find online from years ago, and it just was much more than I ever imagined. I had no idea what I was getting into. Initially I thought it was something I could knock out in 3 or 4 months, but it took 18 months of full-time work researching, interviewing people, and then writing it all. So 18 months to do the whole thing.
right. So, whilst you researched as well, another question on the same, um, what historical events or moments that you came across that kind of created an impact on whilst you went ahead and on fantasy sports, and is also has a mention in your book?
Well, the biggest events were, uh, first of all, when computers came around.
Yep.
That made it a lot easier for people to play. What happened initially is the people who were the commissioners of fantasy leagues would have to get the statistics from the newspaper and manually calculate all the statistics and standings. So the commissioners of fantasy football leagues or fantasy baseball leagues, they would spend several hours a week doing all this.
Right.
And also for the player changes, like each week, say in fantasy football, the people in the league would call the commissioner by Sunday morning to tell them what lineup changes they wanted to make. So the
Right.
commissioner had to do also that. So when computers came around, it made it a whole lot easier. And some of the people who were the first computer people realized they could do this for fantasy sports. So that's where the first statistic services showed up, was people realizing, hey, this new computer thing, we can do fantasy sports statistics for people, make it really easy for them.
True.
And this is like a common thread of the entrepreneurs that I talk about in the book. The common thread mostly is they saw a need for something that didn't exist and they did it, or they saw something that existed but could be done better. They thought they could do better. So, people started statistics services. Other people saw like, gee, fantasy football is great, but there's no information. Let's start a magazine. And, then somebody's like, hey, let's start a radio show, and, just one thing after another. Then
Right.
back to your question, um, the other really huge change was the internet. When the
Yep.
internet, really came around, that now it made it really easy for people to play. They could play against people, without being there in person. They could do their own lineup changes online. It really exploded with the internet.
Yeah, true. In your book, is there any mention of the earliest forms of fantasy sports which could surprise your readers?
Yeah, well, first of all, there are precursors to what I call modern fantasy sports. Now, there were, back in the 1800s, there were like tabletop games where you'd slide a penny into a spring activated bat, and that would hit the penny into various holes on your board for like a single or a home run or an out for baseball, for example. And then, in the 1900s or 2000s, you got, 1900s, you got like board games came about for baseball and football. And then
Right.
there were things that were Stratomatic and APA baseball and football that were based on, real professional athletes in Major League Baseball or the NFL. Now, the difference, though, with that and what I refer to as modern fantasy sports is games like Stratomatic and App are based on the real performance of professional players, but from prior seasons. The difference with fantasy sports is you're getting players for the season that's about to start, so you don't know what they're going to do. So
Right.
if you're drafting a fantasy football team in August,
Right.
it's based on what they do the upcoming season.
Right. And how back do they date? I mean, these sports that you mentioned.
How they what?
How back? I mean, how? I mean, which year are we talking about here? I mean,
Right.
the
Well, yeah. Right. So the 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 guy who started fantasy football, Bill Winkenbach,
Yep.
his first fantasy football league started in 1963.
Right.
Now, before that, in the mid to late 50s, he actually had a game. He had like a little, primitive game for fantasy golf and one for fantasy baseball. Um, and they were compared to what we do now, they were kind of like it was like checkers compared to chess. Very simple. But some people, he mentioned to some people in 1962, he mentioned to a couple of people his games for fantasy golf and fantasy baseball, and they said, "Hey, why don't we do this for football?"
Yep.
So and when they decided that, it was already the season had already started in '62, so they waited to '63 and started football.
Right.
And then fantasy baseball, the the guy primarily credited with inventing modern fantasy baseball is Dan Okren, who started his league in 1980. However, there's a lot more to the story of how he did that. There's actually a myth that he magically came up with the idea on a flight from Connecticut to Texas. That
Oh.
myth that's not true. He didn't magically come up with the idea. There's a lot more to the story. It goes back actually 20 years prior to that.
Right.
And now, besides what he came up with, which is still kind of the basis for modern fantasy baseball, before that, there were lots of random people all over that had like little, like primitive games of fantasy baseball that they would play with friends.
Right.
And, you know, um, like there were some people, like one story I heard of, these people, they had a league where they each took a few Major League Baseball teams. They took the entire team statistics because it didn't occur to them to take individual players.
Right. Right. Okay. So that's. I mean, does your book actually mention these stories?
Oh yes, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
There's
pretty
like
interesting.
lots and lots of stories and information, and then there are people, like it spread worldwide because like Harsh Jain was in England and he
Hmm.
saw fantasy soccer and he liked fantasy soccer and he's from
Right.
India and he thought, well, want to go back to India, like we should do this for fantasy cricket, and
Yeah. Oh.
he started Dream 11. And there was another guy, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, from Italy, who was on a vacation to the United States, and he saw a book about fantasy football, the American football, and he went back to Italy and thought, I can do this for soccer, which they call that football in Italy, but we call it soccer.
Yeah.
So it spread worldwide. My book goes from the beginning right through modern day. Like it starts with the precursors of fantasy sports, the invention and spread of fantasy football, the invention and spread of fantasy baseball, the first statistic services, the first commercial games, the first radio
Yeah.
shows,
Right.
publications, legal issues, the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, and all kinds of things. And then you get through more modern, like the worldwide expansion.
Yeah.
Um, and daily fantasy sports, which is
Right.
was a huge change that came about not too long ago.
Right. Great. Interesting that you shared about how Dream 11 began, and you've covered that as well in the book, and that brings me to my next question very aptly. And you touched upon cricket, right? And cricket is like religion in India,
Yeah.
and you also mentioned about the number of today people playing fantasy cricket. But what's been the impact of fantasy cricket platforms worldwide? across the globe, and I'm sure you've touched that in the book as well. So your thoughts
Yeah. So what the impact of what?
of the cricket platforms,
The cricket platform.
fantasy platforms
Well,
worldwide.
right. Well, it just cricket, because millions of people like cricket, especially in India. Having fantasy cricket just expanded fantasy sports to millions and millions of people, and fantasy soccer expanded it to millions of people, in primarily Europe and South America.
Hmm.
Um, it's like any sport, pretty much you can make a game. You can make a fantasy game out of any sport. You can make a fantasy game out of lots of other things too. Like I mentioned, Iditarod. That's the
Right.
Alaskan snow sledding competitions with where they have dogs pulling sleighs.
Yeah. Yeah. So and you can pick it up. I mean, you can actually. That's really interesting. I mean, in terms of even playing, um, people actually have platforms for that as well. Such kind of games.
Yeah, yeah. There's fantasy wrestling,
Wow.
curling,
Oh my
um,
God.
like everything. I have a list in the book. In the book, I
Mhm.
have a list of different fantasy games that I've heard of in
Right.
researching the book, and there's more than 50 items.
Right. Right.
And
Um,
since releasing the book, I heard of one more that I hadn't heard of before.
you've never heard of before.
Yeah, it was actually fantasy curling. I had not heard of until the book was out.
Right. So that's what even the research would have done, right? So Larry, you would have come across various other games and new sports that are in the on the fantasy platform, right? It would be an eye opener for you as well, correct?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, what I'm going to do, Larry, is between our questions, I'm going to ask you like a little fun question as well, right? So kind of to break the ice further, and yeah, so give it a chance. If you bump into a genie, what three wishes would you like to ask him?
Uh, I'll go with world peace.
that's,
I'll
that's
be.
needed.
I won't be selfish. I'll go with world peace. I'll do something good for humanity. That would be even better than writing my fantasy book.
Absolutely. That's required in today's world, right? Great. Now, thank you so much for answering that, Larry. Now, touching upon cricket still, what can the cricket fantasy platforms learn from the other fantasy sport platforms across the world?
Well, a lot of the fantasy sports platforms are successful, and when people start new platforms, whether it's cricket or other things, they've, they typically are now able to contact good experienced people that can help them start a platform. Where like years ago, people were kind of inventing this stuff and they had to figure it out and work out the bugs and everything. But now, if you want to start a fantasy platform, if you want, there's a lot of people, you can pay them to help you launch your platform because they know how to do it.
Right.
Um, but one other thing is when Harsh Jain started Dream 11,
Yep.
it was not successful for a good while. It was losing money. It was not successful. But the change that he made was basically copying what daily fantasy sports was doing in the United States with like FanDuel and DraftKings. He kind of copied that format for his fantasy cricket. That's when Dream 11 took off.
Right. Right. Are there any interesting differences that are between how fantasy sports developed in the US and how are they growing in countries like India? Do you see a major difference right now?
It's pretty. I mean, it's pretty similar. Like I just said, when they copied the daily fantasy sports platform, they took off. But then there's also there's legal issues. There are
Right.
legal issues that people went through in the United States
Right.
uh, about the biggest thing is fantasy sports gambling, and it was
Hmm.
determined by the federal government in the United States it's not gambling, and approximately 45 states say it's not gambling, but there's
Right.
still about 5 states in the United States that say it is gambling. And then Dream 11 went through the same thing in India, where, in India, there was a question of, is fantasy cricket gambling? And it went to this, I forget what you call your Supreme Court in India, but it went, to your highest court in India, and they determined, okay,
Yeah,
it's not gambling.
right. It's not gambling, right?
Yeah, so very similar, um, things that occurred.
Right. Um, Across the world today, how has fantasy sports evolved, as a business? And do you see India as a big market in the future, a significant market in the future, when it comes to fantasy sports? Because right now it's only confined to cricket, but do we see other sports growing as well?
Well, yeah, like back to Dream 11 again. They offer about 10 other sports.
Yep.
Uh, they've got kabaddi and they've got badminton, futsal, rugby, volleyball, handball.
Right. So slowly and steady, they're evolving into other sports as well. So
Yeah,
you see the market really growing, booming in India as well in the future.
yeah. Now, cricket, of course, cricket's the most popular, and it's always going to be
Right.
the most popular, which is fine. But
Right.
yeah,
Right. As a fantasy sports expert, Larry, what's the most memorable league or game you've been part of, and any experiences that you have shared in the book about the same?
well, there's nothing in the book about my own fantasy leagues. The book is not about me or my opinions. It's
Right.
so, but um, one, as far as the most memorable, I would say the most memorable are the ones where I get together with people in person, where
Right.
we do our drafts. Like we have a weekend. I'm involved in a couple of them where we get together for a weekend in March, and the actual draft is going to be like 4 or 5 hours. But
Right.
other than that, people are hanging out together,
Right.
during the weekend. So it's really nice getting together. And this is one thing that's a very common thread through the book that just in doing all the research and writing that I just discovered was the phenomenon of fantasy sports is it brings people together. It
Right.
brings together friends,
Yep.
coworkers, parents and
Oh,
children. You got people like, there's a couple stories in the book of people who started fantasy leagues in like high school or college, and there's people are still playing together 50 years later.
right.
It's like fantasy sports. It's great because people love it and it brings people together. Um, there's I got a good story about a 9-year-old kid joining. He wanted to join his father's fantasy football league, and he
Right.
needed to earn money to join the league. And he wanted to get a job as a delivering newspapers.
Right.
And the local newspaper company had a rule: you had to be 10 years old. And he was 2 months before his 10th birthday. And his parents lied to the newspaper company and told them he was 10 years old so he could get the paper route.
Right.
And so he got the paper route. He earned enough money to join his dad's fantasy football league. And this 10-year-old is playing against 23 adults, and he beat them all and won their Super Bowl.
Wow. Wow. And he made his money as well, right?
Yeah. And you got like, there's like a fantasy football draft in Las Vegas where you have a plumber sitting next to the CEO of a Fortune 500 company,
Right. And
and
I've
the two of them are talking like they're best buddies.
right. Absolutely. And I've read this somewhere. Even you mentioned about five nuns sitting at a convent and actually making their own teams and playing
Yep,
fantasy sports.
yep.
That's interesting. Pretty interesting. Um, Now, be aware of that a lot of people play fantasy sports in India, and around the world, but specifically in India. How does your book, or would your book help them in getting more experienced, or would help them to look at fantasy sports in a different manner, or help them to kind of play fantasy sports better?
Well, the book is not at all about how to play fantasy sports better,
Right. Right.
but it's people who already play fantasy sports
Right.
have loved the book. It's like if you like fantasy sports, you will love this book because the stories are fascinating and it
Right.
tells you how it all happened. I mean, there are even people like Paul Charchian was the president of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association for 12
Right.
years,
Right.
and he's been in the industry his entire life. And he read the book and he said, I've been in the industry my whole life. I've been the head of the trade association for 12 years. I didn't
Right.
know a lot of this stuff. He
Right.
thought it was fascinating. Um, yeah, and also there's there are people who've read the book and liked it that have never even played fantasy sports because it's more about the stories of the people and what they did and the entrepreneurs, than about just fantasy sports. So, if anybody's like an entrepreneur and interested in business or starting a business, there's some good stories about what people did.
Right. Great. Another fun question, Larry, to you. If you have to spend time with a famous personality, who would that be and why?
Oh my God, famous personality. Only one? Jeez. Uh, oh God, I'll say Muhammad Ali.
All
I don't know
right.
why. Just I thought of like 20 different names. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
if I could
And why?
really do if I could really do that, I'd have to spend a little time really thinking about who I wanted to spend time with.
Okay. So I just put you on the spot there. But Muhammad Ali is a good choice as well. He was a fighter.
Yeah, but he's an
Yeah.
interesting personality. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. All right. So, what advice would you give for people who would like to start their own fantasy league? In a way, your book touch that as well in terms of people can get some insights of if they plan to start their own fantasy league, what they need to do, what they should not be doing.
No, really, it's not about that at all. It's just
Okay.
it's not about how to start a fantasy league or how to play better. It's not about that at all.
Right.
It's just about the history of what happened, who did what. Um, like for example, going back to the first statistics service, the one when people got computers and they offered statistical services. I mean, one of them, um, a guy named Peter Pizarros and a few of his friends, they started a company, and Peter worked literally 23 hours a day
Right.
for a few months to get his company launched because they had a deadline. And what the work he went through was incredible, but it worked out. It became the basis for CBS Sports Statistics Service, and
Right.
they made a lot of money. And then there's another one of the first statistics services. A married couple, Jim and Gloria Berger from Pennsylvania, started a statistics service. And what they had to do back then for baseball was every Tuesday, the USA Today would publish the American League statistics for the week. And on Wednesday, they would publish the National League statistics. So
Right.
Gloria would read the statistics to Jim and he'd enter them into the computer and they'd get the report out in the mail to their clients on Wednesday night.
Right.
Um, by the way, that's another way that the internet really helped revolutionize it. Is back then you would mail the report, people would have to wait. So like if your fantasy week ended on Sunday, the statistics would be mailed on Wednesday, and you'd get them
Okay.
like on Saturday or something. So you had to wait 6 days. Whereas
Right.
with the internet, you could just get the statistics
Real time.
on a website right away. Yeah, but
Literally.
anyway, so one Wednesday though, one Wednesday, Gloria went into labor with her first child,
All right.
and they didn't let a little thing like going into labor stop them from doing their job. So in between contractions, Gloria read the statistics to Jim, and then she'd say, "Oh, wait a minute, hold on, I got another one coming." Okay, it passed, and then she'd continue, and they got their reports out in the mail on time and delivered their first child.
Wow.
And the baby that was born that day is now 37 years old and plays in a fantasy football league with her dad.
Wow. Wow. And you get to read such fascinating stories in your book. Am I right, Larry?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Wow. Now, I mean, what trends do you foresee in the fantasy sports industry over the next decade, Larry?
I really don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, I don't really try to project anything. I mean, it's
Right.
obviously fantasy sports is here to stay, and every
Yep.
time you think it can't grow anymore, it does keep growing more.
Right.
Um, but I just think there's a lot more of the same what people are already doing, and what new idea somebody's going to come up with, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's evolving. It's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, we get to hear a lot about fan engagement in fantasy sports, right? My next question to you is, how have fantasy sports impacted fan engagement with actual sports, and do you see it changing over time?
Well, it's been well documented for many years that people who play fantasy sports watch more sports on TV. They buy more of like the Major League Baseball or football packages for TV.
Right.
They buy more merchandise.
Right.
Um, initially the professional leagues and players associations were very resistant to fantasy. They thought it was gambling. They thought it would kind of, people would like players instead of teams. It took them a long time to come around and realize it was actually a good thing for them.
Right.
Um, Clay Walker was the head of the National Football League Players Association. He's one of the people I interviewed. He was like ahead of his time. He was the first person with a Players Association or league to realize fantasy sports was actually good for them. Because it's like who 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 knows who the backup second baseman on the Pittsburgh Pirates is?
Right.
People who play fantasy sports. Who knows every tight end in the National Football League? People who play fantasy sports. Uh,
Got it. Got it. Have you noticed any ethical considerations that fantasy sports players or organizers should keep in mind?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Right. So, have you noticed any ethical considerations that fantasy sports players or organizers should keep in mind when it comes to being ethical when they play the fantasy sports, or when they go ahead and they're indulging in playing on these platforms? So, are there any ethical considerations that they need to keep in mind?
Well, there's a lot of legalities for fantasy
Right.
sports. Like when
Right.
that's one of the companies in the United States. They now have so many rules and regulations that they got to
Right.
follow. It's difficult. That's why there there's some companies that sold off to bigger companies because they couldn't deal with it all. There's a guy, one of the guys I interviewed in the book. He said, like he used to be an entrepreneur and running his business, and now all he does is study the legal ramifications of everything they do.
Right. Right. Um, my last final, my actually final few questions, Larry, for you is, um, which sport actually during your research, right? Which sport that you came across has played a pivotal role in revolutionizing the entire fantasy platform or the fantasy sport
Yeah.
industry? I beg your
Well,
pardon.
right. Well, I wouldn't pick just one, but I'd say,
Yeah.
baseball was the first big one,
Yeah.
but football surpassed it very quickly, in the United States anyway. Football is definitely the most popular in the United States. Now, meanwhile, some people, there's a company called Sportsmark where some people in Canada made fantasy hockey available to everyone in Canada. They ended up
Right.
with like a million people playing fantasy hockey in Canada.
Yep. Yep.
Um, so they were doing that, and then you get people like the guy in Italy I mentioned who brought fantasy soccer to Europe. For first Italy, then I went to England, then South America, and then you got Harsh Jain who brought cricket to India. So
Right.
it was all those things.
Right. Great. What do you hope for your readers of the book to take away from your book?
Um, they will see how great fantasy sports are and how it brings people together and why it's a cultural phenomenon. They will be inspired by many of the stories. They will
Right.
laugh at many of the stories.
Right.
Uh, they'll even want to cry on a couple of the stories. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Great. Great. Great, Larry. And if one has to grab your book in India, how can they do, and where they can do it, and how can you share some views of yours?
Well, it's available on Amazon and most booksellers' websites have it paperback and ebook.
Right.
Anybody who likes fantasy sports will love it.
Yeah.
If you know somebody, if you like fantasy sports, either buy it now or get it on your holiday gift wish list. And if you
Absolutely.
know somebody who likes fantasy sports, get it for them for a present.
Great. Great. During the holiday season, you mean?
Yeah, right.
And before that, well before that, so they can start reading it. Great.
Yeah.
Great, Larry. Thank you so much. But I have another fun question for you. Uh, if given a chance, you had to, play a sport professionally, which would that be?
Um, Said baseball. No, actually, no,
Baseball.
no, actually, no, golf. I'll go golf.
You know, golf
Yeah.
professionally. All right.
No,
And if you were a superhero, which is that one superpower would you like to possess?
strength.
Yeah. Okay, strength is what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Great. All right, Larry, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for sharing all the lovely insights about your book. Before we take a leave, one final message that you would like to share to your readers from your end.
I'll just repeat. If you like fantasy sports, you got to read it. There's never been anything like this. The reviews are great. In fact, if you go on Amazon and look for the History of Fantasy Sports by Larry Schecter,
Right,
you can get more details of what's in the book, and you can read. That's where most of the reviews are.
right, great. Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you so much for doing this with me. And once again, it's a pleasure that you kind of chose me itself, and I was somewhere surprised that you kind of wrote into me to kind of speak about your book. Thank you for sharing all the insights, and I hope that the book does amazing. It's getting rave reviews, and I
Yeah.
hope it's just a big success. So all the best, Larry, for that.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks a lot for having me.
All right, there you have, my friends, my guests. Please go ahead and share your comments. Thank you for watching in. And please go ahead and, if you can, grab the book and read and get to know more about fantasy sports. Thank you so much. And please follow my episodes in the house with John Elvis till I meet again and bring another guest for all of y'all. Thank you so much and take care.